Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Glenn Mills. It is time to go inside Utah politics. We do begin this morning with Salt Lake Tribune columnist Robert Gehrke. Robert, always glad to have you on the show. Thanks for making time for us.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Big election coming up, especially on a national scope when you take a look at the balance of power. But as we are now just weeks away and approaching it ever so closely, what are some of the major storylines you're keeping an eye on?
I mean, the race this year is that Senate race, as you mentioned in the intro, between Evan McMullin and Mike Lee. And it's really hard to get a good read on where this race is. Evan is doing something that we've never seen done before in the state, running as an independent, trying to bring some disaffected Republicans, those independents, you know, a lot of the state, about 40% of the state is independent. And then the Democrats, with that sort of unprecedented move of not nominating a candidate and instead throwing in with McMullin. There is on paper a path for him to do that, but it's proving to be pretty difficult. And what we're seeing already, you know, still a couple months out from the actual election, is a lot of money pouring into this race, millions of dollars from, you know, outside groups supporting them, from the candidates themselves. And so we're going to continue to see that. It's going to probably set records for spending and I would say also probably for nastiness of the campaign. In Utah, we tend to be a little genteel. We kind of don't like the rough and tumble politics, but this one's already right out of the gate getting pretty heated.
Yeah, and that's unusual for us in the general election. We haven't seen a competitive statewide race in decades.
No.
What significance is that when you consider it?
Yeah, I mean, it's been 30, 40 years since we've seen a competitive race, and that was probably for the gubernatorial run. Yeah, I think it's, people talked about how this might depress Democratic turnout. But I think if you have a competitive race at the top of the ticket, you might actually see more turnout. And that might have some impacts down ticket, maybe not in the congressional races, but potentially in some of the legislative races. And maybe in particular the Salt Lake County race between Suzanne Harrison and Richard Snellgrove. That's one I'm watching really closely because the balance of that council could depend on the outcome of that race.
Also on the county level, you have an open seat in the county clerk that hasn't been open in 32 years.
Right.
That's a pretty fascinating race as well.
It's an interesting race because of all the election dynamics we have. With the election denial that comes out of the Republican Party, some of the you know, reforms, I guess, to put it politely, that the Republican candidate wants to institute. And then you've got a young up-and-comer in Lanny Chapman on the Democratic side, and it's going to be real contested, and there's a lot that depends on it. In Utah County, for example, sort of the impact that some of these clerks have, the candidate down there wants to do away with mail-in voting, which doesn't have the authority to do that unilaterally, but there could be a push for that. And these clerks do have a lot of influence on sort of the ease and the ability for voters to cast their ballots.
Yeah, and I am going to have, just to let our viewers know next week, the two Salt Lake County clerk candidates here on the show so that you can get to know more about them. You wrote a very interesting article on third-party candidates. Why do they run when they have no chance? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, everybody pays attention to, in the Senate race in particular, you know, we talked about Evan McMullin, Mike Lee, they get all the attention. You have these, every year you have candidates running at various levels who really don't have an opportunity to win. The system is rigged to sort of benefit the parties in power, that you get two choices. And so what motivates these people to put in their own time, their energy, their effort to run? And this individual I focused on, James Hansen, he's a school teacher down in Monument Valley on the Navajo Reservation, a libertarian candidate, never run for office before, and he says he's doing it because he wants to get his message out there about making the world more peaceful, more just, and it's sort of this fundamental belief that there needs to be a dialogue and maybe other choices, and that people should cast their ballots for the person that they believe in, not necessarily Republican or Democrat.
Another interesting point that ties into the Senate race with Lee and McMullin is you talked about how he's trying to draw conservatives and liberal Democrats to him. How could that potentially impact this race? And particularly Misty Snow you brought up.
Yeah, it is interesting because James says he would hope to get about 3.5%, which is what the Libertarian candidate for president, Gary Johnson, got when he ran in 2016. It's not going to put him in the thick of it, right? But 3.5% in a tight race could sway the outcome. He could be a spoiler. He says he doesn't think he's a spoiler. He said he thinks people, again, should vote for the candidate they believe in the most. But, you know, there are Republicans who are upset, he says, that he's talked to who have you know, fallen out with Mike Lee because of the January 6th and his support for Trump before and after that. And then he specifically pointed me to Misty Snow, who said she's going to be voting for James Hansen because he's the only candidate in the race who's pro-choice and is better on LGBTQ issues than Evan McMullin. And so there is a segment of the Democratic Party who's not coming around to Evan. And how much is that going to be, and what impact could that have? I mean, we got to wait till November, I guess, to see.
Yeah, that's the larger dynamic there, because Misty, we all remember, ran against Mike Lee last time.
Yeah.
But there was this question: will there were about 43% of delegates who said we don't want to do this. We want to put Kel Weston as our candidate on the ballot. So will they come around for McMullin? And obviously, it's not scientific, but that's one person saying no, she won't.
Yeah, I'm kind of two minds on this. I think there are some Democrats who you're not going to get. They don't like that McMullin is sort of moderate, trying to thread this needle between the Republicans and the Democrats and the conservatives and liberals. And they're not going to get on board with that. But I think for some, there's the possibility that, as we mentioned earlier, this is going to be the first competitive statewide election we've seen in a long, long time. And that opportunity for Democrats to, for the first time in decades, to have their vote actually count might bring more of them on board. So I'm kind of the mind that most of the Democrats will get on board, not all of them certainly. And will it be enough? I think that's the question we got to see. The polls right now are all over, and we can talk about those if you want. Both candidates have their own polls that say that they're doing well. Mike Lee says he's ahead by 18. Evan says he's ahead by 1. They can't both be right. Some of the independent polls, the Utah Debate Commission had one out that had Lee up by about 10 or 11. And there was a centrist PAC that came out with a poll that said it's about 3 or 4. So, it could be anywhere in there. I think the centrist PAC one is interesting because they polled this race earlier and it was a much larger lead for Lee. And that sort of would indicate, if their polling is accurate, that the race is tightening some, which isn't surprising.
You talk about the moderate Republicans. What are you hearing as you talk to them? As I do, I hear a lot of them say, in the end, we're going to go with Lee, because mainly concerns of committee assignments and party loyalty in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing for them. They don't want to see this race, and this race could potentially, if McMullin wins this race, it could determine the outcome of who controls the Senate, especially the direction some of these races in Wisconsin and Georgia are going. So when they look at that, there is some concern, probably rightfully so, that if they vote for Evan McMullin, it might keep Democrats in power, and they don't want to see that. So I think you will see people who are on the fence, Republicans who are on the fence, maybe come home to Mike Lee at the end of the day, say, maybe we're not comfortable with the way he behaved around January 6th and after the election, but ultimately it's a team sport, and we would rather see Republicans in power than 2 more years of Democratic control of the Senate.
Such a fascinating race, and we'll be watching every minute till the end. Back to the third-party candidates, we saw 2 of them qualify for the Utah Debate Commission's debates. So you talk about James, who doesn't have as big of a platform, but 2 candidates in both the second and fourth are going to have a bigger stage to share their message. And
they kind of are making some headway. Some of the candidates are making some headway, and I think this United Utah Party has been fighting for a long time to get membership, but this polling shows that maybe they are gaining some traction. We had a third-party candidate, libertarian candidate, in one of the debates last time around. Rob Latham debated. So it's not unprecedented. It's not unheard of, and I think my personal feeling is that it brings something to the discussion. It brings a variety of viewpoints, and they can kind of play off each other. It changes the dynamic a lot, so I'm excited to see it.
All right, Robert, always appreciate your insight and having you share it with us on the show. Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Great to be here.
So the latest poll from the U.S. Senate.